how are you?
Good, how are you? What are we
Good.
talking about today?
We're talking about friction. What is friction?
I don't know. What is friction?
Friction is the resistive force that has to be overcome for two objects to either start moving past each other or to keep moving past each other.
Okay.
So we've all had experiences with friction. Anything from walking across the floor, you've got friction between your feet and the ground. Driving your car down the road, there's friction between your tires and the road. So friction, anytime you got two objects in contact with one another, it's friction between them.
Okay. All right, so there's three types of friction. There's static friction, which we're going to abbreviate as an F with a small s. There is kinetic friction, which we abbreviate with F with a small k. And there is rolling friction, which we have an F with an R.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about static friction first. What is that?
All right, static friction is when you have, first of all, what does the word static mean?
Staying still.
Staying still, something that's not changing. So when you have two objects that are touching one another, but they're not moving past one another, you have to overcome initial friction. That static friction is what we call it, to get those two objects to move past one another. So let's say I have my sandpaper and this block. All right, so right now they're not moving. There's no change, so it's static. So in order to get them moving past one another, it takes a good bit of force just to get them in motion. So that initial force that you have to overcome, we call that the static friction force. Now kinetic means
Movement.
So once you start moving this past one another, then you have to overcome a force to keep them moving past one another. So that would be your kinetic friction. So the amount of force required to get them moving is a lot greater than the amount of force required to keep them moving past one another.
Okay. And then we've got rolling friction, which is the kind of friction you have whenever you've got a wheel or a car or something spinning. Okay, so it counts on the friction between the ground and the wheel. So it actually, if you lose friction between the wheel and the car, that wheel spins and the car doesn't go anywhere. This is what they call a burnout whenever they burn out their tires. So you don't want that to go forward. You want the friction to be in between those wheels so that way it can move forward.
So that's rolling friction. Rolling friction, anything that spins, any type of wheel, your wheel between the pavement, the ground, the dirt, whatever it may be, that's your rolling friction. So we've got kinetic, we've got static, and we've got rolling.
Okay. We also have to talk about the coefficient of friction. What is the coefficient of friction?
Coefficient of friction is something that is unique to the two surfaces that are in contact with one another. So going back to my wooden block and my sandpaper, there is an amount of friction that is needed to get those two particular materials to run past each other. And generally it's constant and it's unitless. So the coefficient of friction for, let's say, the sandpaper and a wooden block is going to be high because the sandpaper is pretty rough. Whereas the coefficient of friction between, let's say, the wooden block and a piece of glass would be a lot lower because those two are they're a lot smoother. So one term that I like to throw in when talking about friction is something called micro welds. So micro welds, if you were to look at even the smoothest surface under a microscope, you're going to see all these little jagged imperfections, kind of like a mountain range, like peaks and valleys.
Right.
So two surfaces that are smooth, their micro welds are not very deep. They're pretty shallow. So it's pretty easy to get those two jagged surfaces to move past each other. But two surfaces that are very rough, they're going to have deeper micro welds. So it takes a lot more force to get them. So the coefficient of friction that's large, they're going to have really deep micro welds that get tangled up in one another. Whereas something that has a lower coefficient of friction, their micro welds are going to be a lot shallower and a lot easier to get to move past.